This is a comment that or criticism that somebody made against my post that I posted at Quora in the space called Electrical Science. Franco Bruno Cordelletti is the administrator of that space, and I'm one of its contributors. So the posting was about a circuit, and mostly it was about the data of the circuit. I didn't really explain a whole lot. So I want to make this video in explanation, reiterating, I should say, reading my response, but first I'll start with his comment. You claim that conservation of energy only applies to conversion of energy and not generation. Tell me, do you even know what energy generation is? Because the collective human knowledge does not know how to generate energy. All we've been able to do in our entire history was manipulate it from one form into another. It's not my fault that that's the case. Always with losses, some more than others. Why superconductors are worth the research even though we can only have them exist at hard to maintain temperatures is because they don't have losses. Earlier in this, you also stated that it is not something from nothing, it is more from less. This is contradicting itself, as more from less when referring to energy implies that there is more total energy at the end than there was at the beginning, which is itself claiming to be able to create and destroy energy. Very good criticisms, but coming from ignorance. Remember that every piece of matter has some form of energy in potential form and some in the form of heat or light, etc. The ultimate goal in terms of energy generation is converting it perfectly from one form to another without any losses. Even a hydroelectric power station that uses a natural river is using energy from the sun and gravity to generate electricity. The sun being used to replenish the water reserves and gravity providing the necessary force to spin the turbines, which in turn use induction to generate electricity. You also argue that it working does not mean you can make money from it. Do you know how stupid you'd have to be to not know how to make money from a relatively infinite source of electricity? Question mark. Set up a shack and then recharge car batteries after rectification and voltage control for money if you can't think large scale. Okay, here we go. My response. You have not been paying attention to history. Many an inventor has come and gone with nothing commercial to show for his efforts, not for lack of trying, but for lack of public awareness to support his success. It's true that we don't control the public media, nor do we control the educational system which teaches you, and many others, what is wrong and what is right, and to be able to tell the difference between the two. Yet all of us have been kept ignorant on how flexible is energy. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, yet it can be converted from one format into another format. Sound advice, yet let's take this one step further. If we were to disassociate the ingredients of electricity from one another, yet continue to retain these elemental ingredients together in close proximity, retained within the same circuit which spawned this disassociation, then we'd have voltage alone plus voltage divided by resistance, and both within a context of time. We will have satisfied the conversion of energy from one format into another format, for we will have converted watts into volts amperes, real power converted into reactive power of a negative unity power factor. This voltage divided by resistance is what we also call current. In other words, a change in voltage over time due to the impact which resistance has upon voltage. This disassociation, conversion, of real power into reactive power of negative unity power factor is brought about by inverting current's phase relation when compared to the phase relation of voltage. If they can be maintained with 180 degrees of angular difference between them throughout the entire cycle of oscillations, then we'd have the definition for an electrical output of a conventional rotary generator or a battery. Both of these conventional examples, a battery and a rotary generator, merely convert the energy of an external prime mover into electrical energy issuing from their outputs. A battery converts the chemistry placed inside of it, and a rotary generator converts falling water at a hydroelectric power plant. Sorry. But, for emphasis, once we've converted real power into reactive power, the conservation of energy no longer applies to reactive power. That's the catch, i.e., trick and dirty little secret. This is due to the inability for an inductive or capacitive load to be able to see reactive power and thus convert it into real power so that it can exit the circuit as light or heat or the motion of electromagnetics in a motor. Only resistance sees reactive power. As far as a load coil, for instance, is concerned, the reactive power is invisible until it meets up with resistance and gets corrected for its negative unity power factor to become positive unity power factor and exit the circuit. Because of this inability for a load to see reactive power of negative unity power factor, it clones copies of itself at every half cycle of oscillations. What I forgot to mention was that due to harmonics, every half cycle of oscillations becomes a new cycle of oscillation upon which is based another half cycle of that. In other words, every oscillation doubles in frequency. And this is because of what I'm about to say for the remainder of this criticism, but I left out that part, sorry. Meanwhile, the prior waves do not die out, so this is why the energy keeps accumulating, because new clones are made at every half cycle. Every half cycle becomes the basis for the next cycle, which continues to have itself, thus doubling the frequency. And the prior oscillations do not die out like you would expect them to, because no non-resistive load can see them to impede them. Now, any kind of resistive load will see them and undermine their existence by way of resistance, but impedance, no. Because the very nature of a wave that has its current and voltage split by half a cycle is that it is invisible to a reactive load. That's what I should have said. Oh well. Meanwhile, do not die out, because there is no load to impede them. They remain invisible to a load, a reactive load, until they are converted back into real power waves. This cloning process is commonly called by electrical engineers as resonant rise, in which the reactive power of negative unity power factor surges upwards towards the destruction of its host circuit unless checked and regulated from doing so. I guess I better redo that section of the text and correct it, re-update it. We have not created nor destroyed energy. We have expanded or contracted reactive power, which was originally converted from real power before this reactive power was amplified or diminished. Then we may convert this finished product back into real power, with the consequence that this finished product may be greater than or less than the energy which we started with. Does that make sense? Oh boy. Where was I? Conservation of energy was not violated in the intermediate second step because we were dealing with reactive power, which is not energy. It is also lossless. Nor has conservation of energy been violated in the first or third steps of converting real power into reactive power or converting reactive power into real power. Like a potter manipulating the clay upon his workbench, we are gods in the making, for we have the ability to indirectly manipulate energy via this intermediate second step involving not energy but reactance. See how the media, i.e. Wikipedia and our teachers, have misrepresented the slight complexity of the situation by oversimplifying it, by getting us to focus on merely one half of this puzzle, the real part, while encouraging us to ignore the reactant part. You know, it's like the Wizard of Oz, don't look at the man behind the curtain. Don't pay attention to him, ignore him. If you study other avenues of propaganda, more often than not, it is far easier to misrepresent something by merely giving us some of the truth while leaving out other parts. In this partial void of complete knowledge, we are capable of manufacturing fables to help stitch the remaining parts of knowledge that we are aware of together in an attempt to make holistic sense of it all. Yet we have failed to think for ourselves. All I had to do was to ignore our teachers and our common sense and let simulators teach me by way of their setting an example for me to emulate within my thoughts. And then I searched for anyone who would verify my experience. Those teachers are hard to find because they are so unpopular. But that doesn't make them wrong. Au contraire, that makes them even more valuable. True, there are con artists, but they are as simple-minded as is the public, which is where the problem lies, our lack of holistic perspective on this subject. I will finish with one more example. Many times, we are told by Europeans that we Americans are withheld from knowing all of the facts of our current events. Europeans know more about what goes on inside of our own boundaries than we know ourselves. Ask any political critic, and he will tell you this same sad fact. A guy on Energetic Forum by the name of Boguslaw, I didn't state that here, scanned a newspaper article which he found in his local European library, which cannot be as easily found within American libraries if it can be found at all. It was a front-page article on the Amon brothers' demonstration of their EV conversion running around the streets of Denver 100 years ago, and by the way, may I add, without any battery to power their EV. One of the brothers never made it to the United States Patent Office, not for lack of trying, but because he was arrested on charges that he was stealing energy from the grid. How else do you charge someone with arrest and maintain our collective ignorance at the same time but by lying? He wasn't stealing anything, since only the consumers of the electric utility grid at the perimeter of the brothers' several-mile range of influence suffered any loss of power due not to any loss, but to a disturbance, i.e. conversion, of the power on the grid into its reactive components, but without making up the difference. Meanwhile, the consumers of the electric utility grid, who were located well within the range of influence of the Amon brothers' demonstration, namely located in downtown Denver, had no power outage. Why? Because the brothers were supplying them with power from their device. The correct arrest charge would have been domestic terrorism, not theft, for the Amon brothers were supplying energy only to those customers of the grid who were at the center of their range of influence, while all of the customers of the utility grid within their range of influence were having their power supply coming from the grid disrupted. To the customers at the center of their demonstration, it didn't matter that their grid was having its phase relations between its voltage and its current disrupted, since the brothers made up the difference. But at the periphery of this broadcast radius, no appreciable level of power was able to reach these customers to make up the difference for whatever power coming from the grid was disrupted. So you see what I'm trying to convey is the idea that it's easier to disrupt the grid than it is to either steal energy from it or contribute energy to the customers of the grid. And so consequently, let's say the mile range of influence from their device was 10 miles. So everybody at the perimeter of that 10-mile radius of influence, along with everybody within the interior of that 10-mile radius of influence, were having their power disrupted from the grid. But the people at the center of that radius of influence, it didn't matter, and they didn't even notice that their power was being disrupted, although their meter would notice, but their appliances would not, because they were being supplied with power from the Amon brothers' demonstration. The Amon brothers had a very uncanny device. It broadcast its power, and it didn't really require an electrical connection. It might have had a magnetic coupling going on, but not an electrical connection, if it had any connection at all. And so because it operated on the principle similar to Nathan Stubblefield. And if you know anything about Nathan Stubblefield, it was uncanny. He dealt in a style of electrodynamics that was the other side of the coin to the way we do things. Now, it's not real power versus reactive power. It's a different other side that we're not taught. So there are a lot of different things we're not taught. The side that we're not taught is the magnetic side. We're taught strictly the electrical side. So anytime I do a simulation in a simulator, I have to connect everything. I have to use wire to connect all the components. And only once in a while do I make a magnetic coupling between coils. But Nathan Stubblefield figured out how to do things magnetically with the Earth, getting all his energy from the Earth, magnetically coupled, not electrically connected. And the Amon brothers figured out how to generate or gather, however they did it, energy, but then their power supply was not directly connected to their appliance. In fact, all the Amon brother said he had to do was have the power supply within range, within a certain range of influence, a certain range, distance between the power supply and the appliance. And then he had to have iron in direct contact with insulated coils, copper coils. And then those copper coils came alive with potential charge. And then all he had to do was connect the terminals of that coil together or to a circuit. And the circuit displayed energy. So again, this is just like what I've seen so many times when a spark gap is present but does not light up. That a coil comes alive with energy as if it's generating power, as if it's being moved through a magnetic field without moving it. It's stationary. So there's no prime mover moving it, yet it generates power. And by the definition of a generator. And this defies the law of induction of Michael Faraday, because the coil does not have to be moved, physically moved through a magnetic field in order to generate current and thus power. And this is, I believe, how the Amon Brothers device worked, because it's by its very description, that's how it worked. So my simulations verify that. My experiments in virtual reality verifies that fact. Anywho, it's very interesting, but it died with them. It never got patented. And we have a couple of newspaper articles, only one of which has been scanned, to verify that this event, this demonstration actually occurred. And we really don't know how this device was built nor operated. All we know is it had some iron in it, some wire, some minerals, and that's it. And it fit inside a drum strapped to the front end of a car, an electric car of that era, which we could call a golf cart in our age. One speed only, on, off, versus off on the accelerator pedal, so you don't get acceleration like you do in a normal electric car of today's world. Because today's world, we're accustomed to more power, and so we deliver it. We even have electric race cars that can certainly deliver it. But in those days, their electric car was nothing more than what we would consider to be a golf cart. One speed only, accelerator pedal was not had nothing to do with acceleration. It was simply on versus off. And they had limited range. They had only lead-acid batteries to work with in those days. And so the Amon brothers came up with something that gave their car unlimited range. So, you got to wonder, what have we've been kept ignorant. And I did another video in which I described that there's historical precedence. 1956, they started putting relay stations across the Atlantic Ocean, the sea bottom. And instead of using iron wire, bare iron wire wrapped around the insulated copper core of the transatlantic telegraph cable. And I wondered why they waited so long from the 1880s to 1956 to put this in. And it was because we got our information from via Operation Paperclip from the Nazi scientists who had inherited knowledge of Tesla's inventions that had been stolen over the course of half a century, more than half a century, or half a century more or less, dating from 1895, when he had his lab fire, which was arson, to hide the theft. Neutron bomb, levitation craft, his special generator, which ran on compressed air, all kinds, and the liquefaction of air, all kinds of devices and technologies. So when we acquired them, we gained the realization that, hey, we got to, put a stop to anybody stumbling across things, artifacts in our society, which would give them ideas in their head to work out how free energy, first of all, that it exists and that we've been lying to them with our physics, and secondly, how to go about being somebody of value to their community, because they're giving free energy back to the community, like Robin Hood, stealing from the wealthy corporations and giving to the poor, impoverished masses. So they had to install those relay stations, which were probably capacitor banks, to retard the electric field so that the electric field would not get ahead of the magnetic field traveling along the cable. Whereas the prior technique used by Oliver Heaviside was to boost the magnetic field in order to, by cutting its losses, so that it would keep pace with the electric field, and the two would match in their distant traversal of the transatlantic cable, and meet at the destination in synchronicity with each other, so that you could get an electric signal, namely a dot or a dash Morse code. Because the magnetic field had become retarded and never showed up in time, the electric field would get ahead of it, and if they got any message at all, it was like a week later than what it was sent, and it kept getting later and later. Oddly enough, it kept slowing down more and more. So the magnetic field it's almost as if the magnetic field in its retardation created congestion of traffic of magnetic waves along the cable, impeding against any magnetic traffic sent afterwards that might want to go across the Atlantic grid. It's like a traffic jam of magnetic waves. I'm guessing, I don't know, but that's what it sounds like, an analogy to it. So eventually the magnetic field stopped coming across the Atlantic altogether. It just wouldn't come, and they got no signal, because they were getting the potential from the electric field, but they were not getting the magnetic field, and you have to have both together in synchronicity to be able to get anything to happen. This is positive unity power factor. So when I talk about the generation of power, I'm converting energy, which is positive unity power factor, or some semblance thereof, into negative unity power factor, which is the diametric opposite. Now, some electrical engineers will claim such a thing does not exist. Instead of negative unity power factor, they simply call it the generation of power. It doesn't matter. It's one and the same thing, what you call it. But the truth be told is you convert energy of positive unity power factor into negative unity power factor, manipulate that in its status of vulnerability to manipulation, because it's not energy anymore, it's reactance, pure reactance. And then so that you can either expand it or contract it over a period of time, and then you convert it back into energy of positive unity power factor and use it as you wish to power any appliance you like. So in theory, this nice little 99-cent store calculator with this tiny little solar panel should be enough to power all our needs, regardless of what they may be. Because I have done enough experiments on the simulator with enough circuits to prove to me that it's not how much power you have, it's what you do with it that matters. Haven't we heard this philosophy before? That it's not what you're complaining about, what your problems are, but what you make of those problems. Or do you sit on your fat ass and complain all day long? Blah, blah, blah. Really, it's kind of tedious to have to listen to anybody complaining. Enough said.